just to know you care. Oh, these days there's so much going on. No one seems to want to know. I may be just an old soldier's son. How it feels to grow. Yeah, that's right. You can see me here most every night. You'll always see me staring at the walls and at the lights. Funny, I remember, oh, it's years ago, I'd say, I would stand at that bar with my friends who passed away and drink 3 times the beer that I can drink today. How it feels to grow. I know what they're saying, son. There goes old man Joe again. Hell, I may be mad at that. I've seen enough to make a man go out his brave. Well, they know what it's like. The graveyard is a friend, 'cause that's where they are. Don't seem like they all get friends like well, it's time I moved on. But it's been great just listening to you. And I might even see you next time I'm passing through. You're right, there's so much going on that no one seems to want to know. So keep aware, you keep aware, Lord, friend, and have another drink on me. And just ignore all the other. You got your you've got your memory. They are falling all around me. They are falling all around me. They are falling all around me. The strongest leaves of my tree. Every paper brings the news that every paper brings the news that every paper brings the news that the teachers of my life are moving on. see you anymore. But I'm not really gonna leave you. I'm not really gonna leave you. You're not really gonna leave me. It is your path I walk. It is your song I sing. It is your load I take on. It is your air I breathe. It's the record you set that makes me go on. It's your strength that helps me stand. You're not really gonna leave me. I have tried to sing my song right. I have tried to sing my song right. I have tried to sing my song right. Be sure to let me hear from.
Can we have a little more light? Thank you. Because I realize I'm much more senior than I thought I was. Yeah, that's great. All right. We have time slotted for people to hang around, but a lot of people also have to leave because of Passover. So we'd like, Vic. So welcome everybody. Thank you for gathering in this beloved space, which is one of the first places that we were able to memorialize people that died of HIV and AIDS. People forget that there was a time where nobody allowed us to have memorials in space because they would be afraid of getting HIV and AIDS. So this space is very connected to us. There was a minister here, Arlene Carmen, who was also a health equity fighter, and she was also a person that organized a lot with Joe at the PW Health Group. So, who's in the room? Donna's in the room, who's been photographing Joe since the 90s, and she's here today. Sean served from Pause Magazine, who's changed our life. My friend Tanya is here, a trans right fighter. And we have the incoming CEO of AMFAR, Kyle, here with us. I have Eric Sawyer. Who else is in here? I see Andy. We also have the musicians that came from the UK that actually work in collaboration with Joe, who used to compose music. So they're here. They'll be playing music that Joe composed, and in the program there's a QR code that you can go to their projects and their bios. And David also has information about if you want to get the music as well. Is Lillian here? I didn't see her for 30 years. I also have my friends from TAG, Robert Montaglioni, and my amazing friend from ACT UP, Jason Rosenberg, who I've been organizing for what, since 2012. And then my friend Maddie's here, let's see, and Deb is here, and Brandon drives me crazy, and ACT UP is here. Monday is ACT UP today. We still meet every Monday. I call it my Monday self-harm day. Beck, my sister Beck is here, who'll be speaking about Sally's experience, who was the director of the PWA Health Group, which Joe told me of all the things he'd done in this space of HIV and AIDS was the thing that made him the proudest. So my name is Ivy Kwan Arce. I've been positive since 1990. Joe was my doctor. Michael Callan introduced me to him. Many of you were patients and friends, so I've heard a lot of stories about going out to theater, eating oysters. Joe was just my doctor, in short of like being scared as going to the principal's office. I only connected with Joe after he returned to the UK, and usually we would talk about Sally and how Sally was doing, when Sally turned 60, when her health started to fail. We connected about that. So, as I was saying, the PW Health Group was a space where Tim Horn actually brought me in. Is a place where I look forward every week because I had a space to learn about the science and about blood work. So when I met Joe, I was a typical young person that never had been in a doctor's office, so I didn't have regular checkups, but suddenly I was very sick, and the one thing I remember is he would give me a copy of my blood work, and then he would just like say all these things, and then at the end of the appointment, I'll give him back my paperwork, and he would say, well, this is for you. And I'm like, well, you know, that's when Xerox costs money, and I didn't understand that. And he goes, this is the way you track when you come back. Next time to see whether you're progressing or you're further down the line of your illness. Simple, basic things for people of color, for women, were things that we didn't know how to do. So, as you know, Joe had changed many lives to save many lives. It was a space where I felt safe, and I don't know if Michelle Lopez is here. These are women I've met 33 years and been together as women, as positive women. A couple of weeks ago, I was having dinner with a friend of mine, an artist, and he said to me, aren't you worried about dying? Don't you want to live forever? And I said, you know what? I actually got to live forever. This is the forever. I got to live a life of restored health. I have 2 kids. So this is the forever. I don't see any difference of what forever would be other than that. Since Joe died, we had a memorial in the UK. A few of us went, and I remember it was, I think, important for Joe for us not to have a huge memorial during the pandemic. And I seen Simon and David, who are Simon Watney and David Kuchenbaum, the executor of state, the care that they had been working through all these years, along with consulting with Sean and Rebecca, with so much care, because Joe also lived a very betrayed life in the movement, as we all do as organizers. We probably have a lot of stories and share experience. And one of the persons the persons that are here is Miriam, who's, let me see, this title is really long, Senior Executive Editor at The Lancet, who they chose carefully to write Joe's biography, because it couldn't be done by anybody else but somebody that'd be factual and caring, something that Joe deserves, and much more. So in the house also is my oldest son, who's 25, Atta Marse, and it wouldn't have been possible to be a mother without Joe's work. So with that, we're going to begin our gathering. The first person is going to be Simon, who is a co-executor of Joe's estate. He's in England, so we have a video of him.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this celebration of the life and the achievements of Dr. Joseph Sonnabend. Joe was born in Southern Africa in 1933, and of course he carried the memory of Africa and concern for the rest of the world with him all his life in everything he ever did. He would have been appalled, for example, by the recent PEPFAR cuts and the entirely predictable and it would seem deliberate increase of transmission which is likely to follow, and just the terrible levels of human misery that again predictably follow that kind of level of cuts in funding for elementary service provision, from treatment and care to prevention work. I mention prevention work because Joe was a well-known, distinguished microbiologist as well as a primary care doctor for so many of the long-term survivors in this room as I'm speaking. But he was also one of the great heroes, remember, of Safer Sex, and the little booklet of which there were copies, I think, at the meeting today, of how to have sex in an epidemic was what brought me into contact with Joe for the first time. I picked up a copy at the old Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, some of you will remember, and it proved the basis for all our early work on HIV prevention in the gay community in London in the early years of the epidemic. That's how I first met Joe, and it was a friendship which was one of the most important mentoring friendships of my life. He was also one of my neighbours when he was in London, and especially so, of course, at the end of his life. Anyway, I won't keep going on myself about my memories. There are so many of you out there who I'm sure are wanting to add to the contributions from today's distinguished list of speakers, who will tell you all about the details of Joe's life, his achievements, his personality, and so on. So I hope you have a marvelous celebration. It will be very different to the celebration we had in London, where Joe is remembered as a pure scientist, really, one of the team who discovered interferon, quite unlike the Joseph Sonnabend you guys all knew, as a caring, wonderful doctor, physician, and hero of the global epidemic. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Bill Hipsher, and I met Joe Sonnabend in 1983, soon after I left the Justice Department and joined a small law firm in Manhattan. At the firm, I volunteered with the Lambda Legal Defense Fund and joined its board of directors, something I could not do as a government lawyer. I met Mathilde Krim at a Lambda event focused on legal issues presented by the AIDS epidemic. We spoke for a bit about the AIDS Medical Foundation, and a few days later, she phoned to ask if I would be willing to help the medical director of the foundation with some private legal issues. She explained that Dr. Joseph Sonnabend did not have substantial resources, so the engagement would need to be on a pro bono basis. I met Dr. Sonnabend and learned that he was conducting a general medical practice in Greenwich Village where he mostly treated gay men. And I did provide some legal assistance on the matter that Dr. Krim had spoken to me about. A few weeks later, Dr. Sonnabend called to tell me that the co-op building on West 12th Street, where his practice was located off the lobby, had informed him that his office lease would not be renewed because he treated people with AIDS. He explained that his work at the AIDS Medical Foundation and the Safe Sex Coalition, which he and several of his patients had founded, had become his real focus and that he was considering stopping private practice. But he felt that the co-op's decision was wrong, and he wondered if there might be a useful test case in the making. He would continue his practice if there was. I reached out to Lambda's legal director, Abby Rubenfeld, and we both thought that an AIDS discrimination case against the co-op was possible, though discrimination against doctors who treated people with AIDS did not fit any protected class or other civil rights theory. There were no statutory protections against discrimination based on AIDS at the time. Still, we decided to proceed, and my firm took the case as cooperating attorney to Lambda. Initial legal research concluded that our best shot was to bring the case under New York's handicapped persons protection laws. And we thought it best to add a few of the doctor's patients as plaintiffs, because Dr. Sonnabend was not himself handicapped and therefore might not benefit from protections accorded handicapped persons, even assuming that people with AIDS would qualify for such protections. So two of his patients, Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz, joined as named plaintiffs, and the New York State Attorney General, Robert Abrams, also joined as a named plaintiff. We filed our case in New York's Supreme Court, seeking a preliminary injunction, preventing the co-op from ending the lease on discriminatory grounds. At the first scheduled court hearing, we learned that our judge would be Ira Gamerman, and I was delighted. Justice Gamerman was among the very few judges who regularly attended what was becoming the annual Lambda dinner. We knew that one issue we would have to address in the case was whether AIDS was casually transmissible. Could residents of a co-op contract AIDS by passing AIDS patients in the lobby? The experts were unanimous. The virus could not be transmitted in that manner, and our expert so testified. After the trial, Justice Gamerman issued an injunction preventing the co-op from terminating Dr. Sonnabend's lease, concluding that persons with AIDS were protected by the Handicapped Persons Protection Laws, a complete victory. After the case concluded, we learned that Sonnabend versus 49 West 12th Tenants Court was the first AIDS discrimination case in the country, and that the precedent it set would be relied on again and again. For years after the case, I continued to provide legal services to Joe and joked that he was my longest-running pro bono client. But Joe returned the favor. When Bill Johnson and I tested positive in 1987, Joe recommended an excellent doctor, and he continued to stay involved with our care. He regularly recommended that we add various drugs to our regimen, drugs that only years later became standard prophylactic protections against opportunistic infections. My partner, Bill Johnson, did not tolerate those drugs, but I did, and I truly believe that Joe saved my life. Joe and I remained friends long after. He attended Bill's funeral in 1993, and Richard and I visited him in London when he moved back. One other dividend from the case besides the important legal precedent, after we won, Bill and I invited Joe and his two patients, Michael and Richard, along with Richard Dworkin, to our home for a celebration dinner. At the end of the evening, Michael asked me if I needed a secretary. And as a matter of fact, I did. And so for much of the next year, I got to work with the most amazing secretary I ever worked with. So I thank Joe for introducing me to Michael. And like all of you, I thank Joe for so much more that he did for our communities.
Author Noam Chomsky once said, "We don't need heroes, we need good ideas." Dr. Joseph Sonnabend epitomized that quote. Good ideas were what drove him. Praise and applause did not. There was always too much to do, too many ideas to put into action, and the only way to do that was for informed people to put their differences aside and work together to challenge whatever power-hungry idiots were in charge. When Paz magazine ran a cover story on Dr. Sonnabend, the title read, "The Man Who Knows Too Much." That was often his curse. I'm here to talk about just one of Dr. Sonnabend's accomplishments, the story of our collaboration, not on the invention of safe sex, but rather our invention of sexually explicit safe sex guidelines that went way beyond just condoms. In August 1982, Joe was my doctor when he diagnosed me with early symptoms of AIDS. Everything I read said no one survives. I was 26 and doomed. When I told Joe that, it became the day he saved my life. Joe told me that AIDS was new, so there were no experts. So why would I assume I was doomed? Was I stupid enough to believe whatever I read? Suddenly, I had a ray of hope. Joe told me doctors treating gay men with AIDS forgot the old credo, first, do no harm. They were using treatments that hastened early AIDS deaths. Joe was using prophylaxis medications to prevent the infections that were needlessly killing young gay men with AIDS. I went to work in Joe's office to learn all I could. While organizing his massive library journals, I discovered his published articles in the Journal of Virology. I realized he was more than a doctor. He was a world-class virologist with a distinguished history in lab research. Joe introduced me to another patient, the late Michael Callan, to write and alert gay men. Our November 1982 articles, A Warning to Gay Men with AIDS and We Know Who We Are, called for the end of urban gay promiscuity, but I had nagging doubts. 3 months earlier, when I thought I was dying, I stopped having sex and disconnected my phones to cut off contact with my sexual partners. One night in December 1982, one of those contacts rang my doorbell. I told him I was done having sex and explained AIDS to him. I assumed he'd fly out the door, but instead he asked, can't you just jerk off? Can't you just put on your leather and boots? Let me worship you and jerk off? As soon as Tom came and left, I ran to my typewriter and typed, how to have sex in an epidemic. That was my eureka moment in December 1982. Every day at Dr. Sonnabend's office, while he was treating sick, dying, and AIDS panic gay men, I began pestering him about ways to make sex safe. Is sex all you care about? Joe yelled at me. No, but I had nurtured a close circle of friends and ex-lovers who were my gay family, who I wanted to protect and grow old with. So I kept pestering Joe until one day he exploded. All my patients who have a history of oral and penile sexually transmitted infections are not showing signs of AIDS. It's only my patients with a history of rectal STIs who are. After that bombshell sunk in, receptive intercourse was the risk, I was able to finish writing How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, but with a lot more pestering. In February 1983, when Mandate magazine decided to publish my article, Joe recognized its importance. The pestering, sex-crazed slut made sense. But it took 10 months for the article to appear, and I refused to wait. That's when Joe had the idea to publish it ourselves. He got Michael Callan to join us and turned my article into an expanded booklet we self-published in May 1983. At that time, America had 1,400 cases of AIDS, 558 deaths, and 70% were gay men. Our guidelines worked, so what happened? Gay leaders who championed the gay sexual revolution of the 1970s hated us for saying that promiscuity was causing AIDS in gay men. So they blacklisted us for our mistake instead of confronting their own. They unwittingly contributed to the deaths of their own people. Almost done. It took another 2 torturous years after our booklet came out for the community to agree on what to say in the first safe sex campaign in the New York City area, home to half of all the AIDS cases in America for the first 20 years. By the time ACT UP began in 1987, AIDS cases had climbed to 50,000 from 1,400 when our booklet came out. For 40 years, the most consistent attack on how to have sex in an epidemic is that we were wrong about the cause of AIDS, but that ignores what we got right. As Joe explained, when a new epidemic appears, scientists examine the evidence and propose theories to minimize risk. Theories are just frameworks. They're often wrong in detail, but they're all scientists have when people start dying and we need ways to limit sickness, death, and contagion. Joe used cytomegalovirus as a model. When HIV was discovered 3 years later, it spread the same way as CMV, entering the bloodstream from getting fucked by infected partners. So, Dr. Joe was right about the risk of receptive intercourse, and that's what scientific theories can accomplish, if ideologues and idiots don't get in the way, as they so often do. Joe taught me and Callan that in science, as in life, there's always more to learn, that the nature of being human is we all make mistakes. That's how progress gets made. I was 26 when I told Joe I was doomed. In 6 months, I turned 70. Joe always knew that thousands of gay men like me could still be here with us today. And that's just one example of the curse of Joe being the man who knows too much. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Anyone who was a colleague or patient of Joe's when he was working in New York would no doubt have been astonished to know that he had any free time at all, let alone to play the piano as he had done extremely competently since his childhood, and particularly to write music, which I believe he simply locked in his desk drawer, assuming it would never get performed. Fortunately, when he retired to London, he met my dear friends Andrew Tooby and Morgan Hayes, who are here today, and to cut a long story short, they nurtured his composition, organised performances of his work, and even, sadly, after he died, but an album has been made of Joe's chamber music, and so Emily and I are going to start with the piece which Joe was working on at the time of his death, Synergism for, no, hang on, Synergism for 2 violins.
I'm Sean Strube, a friend and patient of Joe's, but I'm reading some remarks from Donald Kotler, who's the chief of gastroenterology and liver disease and the director of the gastrointestinal training program at Mount Sinai St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital. Don couldn't be here today. Joe and I worked together for 2 decades. He sent thousands of patients with GI and nutritional problems to me. In the pre-heart era, I learned to diagnose conditions with names I'd never heard of prior to the epidemic, including some previously unknown to the medical community. Joe was a classic physician. He used his 5 senses. He learned from his patients, and he could often diagnose solely on clinical presentation without access to sophisticated testing technologies. From Joe, I learned to treat the untreatable. It's been said Joe never missed a funeral of one of his patients. If they did not die at a hospital, Joe was the one who pronounced them dead in their apartments, then called the police to report the death, the medical examiner to release the body, and Braden's funeral home to pick up the body, saving the deceased's loved ones the agony of painful conversations and long delays. Joe took responsibility for his patients during life and in death. Because of Joe, I began my involvement with community-based research in 1986 with the Community Research Initiative, ultimately becoming the board vice president while Joe was its medical director. I would drive him home after board meetings. We'd sit in my car for hours discussing ongoing and planned studies. Joe published the first organized hypothesis to explain the development of AIDS in 1983 before HIV was isolated. We talked extensively about his multifactorial hypothesis of AIDS pathogenesis, which concerned an overload of foreign material or antigens brought on by multiple infections. I talked about my studies documenting an inflammatory process in the intestine in the presence or absence of an identifiable causative agent. It turns out that we were talking about the same process, just with different causes, or so we thought. He recognized what was happening to his patients because of his training in infectious disease, and more importantly, in immunology and the inflammatory process. He realized there was a chronic inflammatory process related to an activated immune system that started long before his patients developed the opportunistic infections and tumors characteristic of AIDS. Joe was criticized for his view on HIV and AIDS, even maligned as a denier of HIV, which simply wasn't true. Even when HIV was identified and he recognized its importance, he still felt that it did not fully explain what was happening to his patients. He was right. I'll finish with a bit of science. Intestines and other mucous membranes exist at the interface of a sterile internal environment and a highly contaminated external environment, yet they have no strong physical barrier between them. The gut needs a large surface area in intimate contact with the external environment to absorb the fluid and energy needed for life, just as the lung needs a large surface area to take up oxygen and dispose of carbon dioxide. The intestines need to be protected from harmful microbes and chemicals, and the immune system needs to recognize and distinguish harmful from harmless. HIV infection results in damage to the intestinal barrier, allowing external material to breach and enter the body, which stimulates an immune response, resulting in the recruitment of more immune and inflammatory cells, leading to their destruction and to chronic intestinal damage. This phenomenon, now known as microbial translocation, was not widely appreciated in the 1980s, but it became a key piece of the puzzle around the turn of the century. It was 2 decades after publication of Joe's hypothesis before the scientific community understood the key role of gastrointestinal tract plays in the development of AIDS and how it was the source of the antigenic material activating the immune system. That process continues even after viral replication is controlled. In fact, it's believed to underlie the accelerated aging process so many long-term HIV survivors experience. What it means for this gathering is that Joe Sonnabend's views on HIV and AIDS were not wrong. They were just only a part, and an incredibly important part, of the story. The virus HIV is the etiologic agent, while the antigenic overload and immune activation, which was Joe's focus, is what we now know drives the pathogenic process. In many ways, Joe was a scientist who was ahead of his time.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle Clifford, Chief Development Officer and incoming CEO at AMFAR. My colleague, our current CEO, and a close friend to many of you here today, Kevin Robert Frost, asked me to express his heartfelt regrets he cannot be with you all here today. Kevin is traveling for work, and he asked me to read the following remarks he prepared in honor of Joe. The last time I saw Joe was in London on February the 21st, 2017. I had reached out to Joe because I was going to be passing through London and asked if we could get together. Joe suggested meeting at the London Institute of Medicine since they had a restaurant and he was a member. I had been wanting to speak with Joe for quite some time. Over the preceding several years, I'd embarked on a project to try and capture AMFAR's history. Not the often told fictional tale of how two powerful women, Elizabeth Taylor and Dr. Mathilde Krim, had created AMFAR, but rather the true story of how it all started and who were the players that made a difference. I was under no illusion that I would arrive at some ultimate truth. History, it seems to me, is always distorted or diluted or intentionally obscured. And in this regard, AMFAR was no different. So much myth had grown up over the years, fueled by many different agendas. I knew that the story most often told, that Dr. Krim and Elizabeth Taylor had together formed this organization out of whole cloth, was just that, a myth. Bits and pieces of the mythical shroud that has been laid over the organization had been pierced by casual conversations I had had with many of the early individuals that were involved in its founding. So much so that I knew that the record would ultimately be lost to history if an effort wasn't made to preserve it. But the more time passed, the more difficult it became to capture that history. And so I began reaching out and speaking to as many of the people involved as I could. I had already spoken to Graham Berry, Michael Gottlieb, Jonathan Cano, and of course, I had countless hours with Dr. Krim in my 30-plus years at AMFAR. But if getting to the true origins of the founding of AMFAR was my goal, then all roads led to Joe. So meeting Joe was essential if I was going to be successful. I had the uncommon, for me, good sense to record our conversation that evening in the restaurant, and much of what I refer to here today comes from that conversation. Joe and I spent more than 3 hours together that evening, going back to the very beginning. In fact, to give me context for his relationship with Dr. Krim, he took me all the way back to the 1960s when he was working on interferon. Joe met Dr. Krim briefly during this time when she was working in Israel. Dr. Krim also had an interest in interferon, and a friend in common introduced the two of them when Joe was visiting the Weizmann Institute. And while Dr. Krim's involvement and early support was crucial to the ultimate success of what would become AMFAR, she became involved in the effort purely because of a chance meeting again later with Joe. Joe's background was in microbiology. He volunteered on Wednesday nights at the Gay Men's Health Project, where he was known as the VD doctor. When the AIDS epidemic started, he was already well connected in the research world, and so he started calling around to his colleagues to start a network of researchers to try and understand what was happening. Colleagues from NYU, Harvard, a friend in Nebraska, and someone on Staten Island. These were the friends Joe brought together to help with the work of figuring out what was going on. Joe would send the friends samples, and together they would analyze what they were seeing and try to make sense of it. None of them were paid to do this work. They were all just doing it on the side. And Joe worked out of his office on 12th Street, which quickly became a hub for research. In fact, it was the boyfriend of one of Joe's patients, Dennis Kellman, who first proposed the idea of forming a foundation to support this work. Another of Joe's patients, Frank Coffey, worked with his partner Graham Berry to file the necessary paperwork to form a foundation, the AIDS Medical Foundation, or AMF. Then one day in 1981, Joe got a call from a dermatologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering who was seeing some strange things and asked if Joe would come to see him. On the way out of that meeting, Joe casually ran into Dr. Krim, who at that time had established a lab at Memorial to study interferon. She asked Joe what had brought him to Memorial, and it was over the course of that brief conversation that he explained to her what he was seeing in his gay male patients. At that time, Dr. Krim was leaving Memorial, and fortunately for Joe, well, for all of us really, her departure from Memorial meant that she had time on her hands, and she decided to visit Joe's office to learn more about the research that he was already leading. Joe said to me that night that Dr. Krim's involvement transformed the work, as she was not only able to help with much of the work that needed to be done, she also proved to be a proficient fundraiser. In fact, the first donation she secured was from her husband, Arthur Krim, a gift of $100,000 to get AMF up and on its feet. But on that night, Joe wanted me to know that the part of AMFAR's history that seemed to have gotten lost is that this began as a grassroots organization in the community of people living with AIDS. People like Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz in the doctor's office that was serving the gay community. Not a government agency with no funding, just a simple doctor's office with his patients working together to try and help each other out. In Joe's words, there's dignity in that. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Joe was a complicated guy, though I suppose most of you already know that. He was beloved by his patients and a fierce advocate for the ideas he advanced. I don't believe that his role in establishing the early research efforts around HIV have truly been recognized and appreciated. That night, Joe expressed concern about his legacy and how he would be seen by history. He said that he too often responded harshly to people, or in some cases he just ignored them. He felt he had been unfairly labeled as sex negative because he counseled his patients on the dangers of promiscuity. But if given the chance to do it over, he said he didn't think he would do it differently. After all, he said, I was only trying to keep people from getting sick. As Joe said, viruses cause disease, but behavior is how viruses are spread. And so in closing, whatever history may ultimately say about Joe's role in the early years of the AIDS epidemic, his contributions to research and ultimately to the founding of AMFAR are profound and will not be lost. And in time, I believe, he will be recognized for this work. I only wish he could have been here to see it. Thank you, Kevin.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca, or Beck Jordan Young, and I'm here as a proxy today, as several other people are for proxies. I am here representing my late life partner, Sally Cooper. Sal died 7 years ago of ovarian cancer, and I'll come around to something about that in a moment, but for about 6 years, Sal was the executive director of the People with AIDS Health Group, or the PWA Health Group, or as most of us called it, from the time I started volunteering with the Women's Treatment Project in around 1993. We just called it the health group. And everybody here, I think, by now knows some of the main facts about the health group. The fact that Joe founded it together with Michael Callan and Tom Hannon. But you might not either know or remember some of the important details that give insights, I think, into what made the health group such an extraordinary place and to what are an incredible monument to who Joe was as a person and what the legacy and power of his work is. Michael Callan and Tom Hannon were musicians, and for years I thought that the health group was founded by a doctor and 2 musicians, but now I know that it was founded by 3 musicians, which is wonderful. And in brief histories, when you hear that, you might not even find out that they were musicians, but it's easy to just think that the scientific mind and the intellect behind the health group was Joe Sonnabend, and that the activism or organizing was Michael and Tom. But one of the things that I learned very quickly was that the health group was an incredibly unique, radical place where these people who were this kind of ragtag group of queer artists had become incredible self-educated researchers. They had become real geeks about understanding what clinical trials looked like, what they should look like, how to sift through data on drugs, how to debate and consider some of the relative benefits of drugs that might seem promising, but were all of the drugs that they were selling at the time, nonprofit, in a little storefront on West 26th Street. All of the drugs were unapproved in the United States. A lot of them were approved and manufactured elsewhere, but they had to figure out how to sort the promising drugs from the snake oil, because there was a lot of snake oil being sold even by other health groups, their buyers clubs early on, because I think people were desperate for anything that might work. But the health group had developed a really rigorous protocol for trying to sift through a way to understand at a very preliminary stage treatments that might be useful for various opportunistic infections that people were getting, that would, they did things like try to figure out not just safety data, but if the drug was safe maybe for some people and not for other people. They did incredibly interesting work, and I never encountered any other community-based organization that was really like it. And I think that one of the most radical things about it was that there was no clear barrier to who could develop and be respected for expertise in that place. And people came in as patients. Sometimes people came in as the beloved partners and family members of patients. And if they wanted to become part of the group of people who were going to understand the drugs and figure out not just what they were going to take home and use or provide to somebody else, they were welcomed into that fold. They were educated. Everybody there was really passionate about making sure that people with AIDS were educated about their bodies, about disease process, about what was coming down the pike, and so on. Now, as far as I know, Joe was the only one, or maybe one of a couple of people that came through at the time I first was volunteering, who actually had any formal training in medicine or in biomedical research. I know that other people came through at different times, but again, that didn't stop him from respecting what people knew, what they could do, what they could learn. I'm not sure what role Joe played in hiring Sal, and I don't know whether anybody knew, probably not, when they hired her, that she didn't even have a college degree. But I do know that he came to respect her very deeply, and she respected him very deeply. Sal was quite brilliant and passionate about the work that she did there, and she was among comrades who were of a level of dedication that I think I've never encountered since then. And it was heartbreaking to me that when Sal became ill with ovarian cancer, she never did find a physician who was able to encounter her in a way that she warranted in terms of the depth of her knowledge around her body, around clinical trials, around what may or may not be promising. And it was a great frustration to Sal that she would walk into doctors' offices and usually know more than they did about all of the range of drugs that had been tried and what was going on and what was the state of various trials. And I never saw a doctor catch up with her in that process, and that was painful, because I know that Joe Sonnabend did that for many, many people and helped to create an incredible space around that. So these people who started out as artists and became, as I said, research geeks, drug smugglers, they ran around the world bringing in drugs that hadn't been approved in the US. They ran around trying to find out where drugs might be made. They manufactured drugs or arranged for them to be manufactured, and they always did work with researchers at every level who would talk to them to try to stimulate better research. So I want to just say that radical belief in people's intelligence and impatience, if people didn't use it, which I think I've heard about, he had a belief obviously in the dignity of people, their rights, and so I have to end by saying I spoke with Ivy and also Rebecca before coming, because typically today I would be heading to a beautiful liberation Seder with my oldest friend and her family, and so it was really moving to me to find out that Joe wasn't just Jewish, but also was deeply influenced by Jewish ethics. And when I read the quote on the screen, and I only got part of it, he had said, "Being Jewish, I think that I've got a strong sense of community, of looking after one's own." He also said, "I never acquired the physician's habit of staying detached. There's no switching off from death and misery." And so I think it's clear from the love and compassion that he brought to his patients like Ivy, that Joe was expansive in terms of who he considered one of his own. And so it's meaningful to me today to feel like I would have been able to talk with him about the struggle that I'm deeply involved in right now for the rights and dignity of the people of Palestine, and the ways in which our struggles are so profoundly connected. I think that everybody who believes in the rights and dignity of people is ultimately moved by the horrors that we see right now, the purposeful defunding of AIDS research and of health around the globe. And so I'm just grateful to have been touched by Joe's legacy, and I'm grateful to have been asked to speak for Sal today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Rebecca Pringle-Smith, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today at this memorial concert to commemorate the life of our friend and colleague, Joe Sonnabend. Thank you to David Kirschenbaum, IVRC, Sean, and Simon for organizing, and a huge thank you and love to the musicians who've come. I'll have a bit more to say about that in a minute. So I'm a physician researcher, activist, and an assistant clinical professor at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai here in New York, where I retained my academic appointment since 2002, although I live in California, partly out of sentimental attachment to Joseph. When he first came to New York, he had an academic appointment as an associate professor at Mount Sinai. And I used to push him to get a full professorship, but he didn't want to do it. And then I said, okay, then I can't get an associate professorship. But we both thought that was fun because, we think all this academic credentialing stuff in a way is a bit of crap. Joe and I are a bit irreverent. So I met Joe in the late 1980s, but I didn't get to know him well. He was somewhat reserved. I met him at a few bedsides of a few friends. He was diffident and somewhat private, but very intensely focused on his patients and on their families and loved ones. I didn't get to be a very close friend of his until 1989, when I was working at Community Research Initiative before I went to medical school as a clinical trials coordinator. I was working on a study of Don Kotler's, actually. He was also a dear friend. And later, Joseph, along with Jim Igo and Paul Meyer, forced me to take a position at the American Foundation for AIDS Research as an assistant project manager for the community-based clinical trials network, for which Community Research Initiative was one of the flagship organizations, along with the County Community Consortium in San Francisco. So as a close friend of Joseph's, but also as a scientist and mentee of his, I had a unique relationship with him, and so I wanted to share with you, I hope to share with you, a couple of aspects of Joseph's life that are not widely available in the public discourse about Joseph. So I suppose first as a friend, as a scientist, and finally as a beloved colleague. Joe was an incredibly generous and fun mentor with a wonderful sense of humor and a capacity for joy. He had a quicksilver mind, and he was a polymath, a true polymath, in science, of course, as we'll discuss, but not just in science, in philosophy and in ethics. He loved his work in ethics and forced me to like it as well when I had become quite cynical about the ethical approvals process through institutional review boards. But maybe Joe's favorite role during those early years at CRI was as a member of the institutional review board. He got me over my cynicism, and as a result, I became a member of the institutional review board at Mount Sinai. These institutional review boards were convened to protect human subjects from possible nefarious activity in human subjects research. I'm not going to go into that, but it's a form of activism, actually, and Joe was quite passionate about it. So there's a part of Joe that I don't think is widely understood because he was contained a lot of the time. But how do I say this? Joe is a human being who was left ravaged, bereft, and enraged due to his personal losses of people with AIDS. It wasn't just rage at the science. He lost lovers and friends and patients who he came to love. I want to mention one friend of ours who was a lover of Joseph's, Al Hanshaw. And Joseph and I grieved together, and Joseph is capable of great, loud grief. But most people didn't see this part of him. And I think, in a sense, this may have led to him being misunderstood in some ways. Some of this grief and rage probably led to him making very strong statements, which were then misunderstood and, to a certain extent, misrepresented in the media and other places. So perhaps because of the grief and the intensity with which he often spoke, it's okay to characterize him as misunderstood. But I think it's a bit more nefarious than that, the ways in which he was misrepresented. This aspect of his scientific identity and credentials, this somehow didn't make it into a lot of the public discourse. When I was working on his obituary with Kit Seeley, she said, well, I don't know why people are going on about this science. He sounds like a compassionate doctor who took good care of a lot of people and started some organizations, and then got into a lot of arguments with people. And it took quite a bit of time to convince her that his scientific pedigree was in fact relevant. So Joe was profoundly entrenched in the upper echelons of the scientific establishment since his graduation from the Witwatersrand School of Medicine in 1956, his inculcation into the Royal College of Physicians as a member of the Royal College in 1961, and well, he did have a job as a physician that's quite interesting. His first job as a medical doctor was as a ship's doctor on a ship taking Muslim pilgrims from Indonesia, pilgrims who were making the Hajj to Mecca. I think there were 4,000 people on this boat, and he did quite a bit of work taking care of them and learned a great deal in his subspecialty of infectious disease. But Joe also did fellowship at Mill Hill, which is in the Medical Research Council, which is sort of the equivalent of NIH. It's a profoundly important place where incredible work was done. And he worked with the Nobel laureate, the immunologist Peter Medawar, who's the person who discovered the MHC class II receptor. This isn't just some obscure term. This is what allows our bodies to distinguish between self and other. So Peter Medawar is one of the founding fathers of modern immunology. And that's part of Joe's pedigree. And the organ transplantation process made it possible and led in the 1970s to the study of prophylaxis for opportunistic infections. This was in the 1970s. And Joe advocated for this strategy to be used in AIDS, which was considered radical and crazy. But this was a very well-validated way of caring for people, and aerosolized pentamidine worked. And PCP, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, was in fact the #1 cause of death from AIDS. It wasn't like the virus suddenly zapped everybody. So I just think it's worth commenting on that. And when I was soliciting letters for Joe's academic appointment, reviewing them, you know, there were a few from Nobel laureates, and we used to talk to pretty distinguished scientists frequently socially. I remember Tony Fauci was astonished to learn this, and he acknowledged to me that Joe's credentials, in fact, eclipsed his own. And perhaps he was just being charming, but I agree with his assessment. So why is Joe often portrayed as this radical? Well, some of the reasons are nefarious, but there are also cultural reasons. Joe was trained in the British tradition of science, which I conceive of as pretty different from the American tradition, although there are a variety of opinions about that. My dad did a postdoc at Oxford, and I grew up with close friends of his from there, so I was familiar with this culture. When I contrast the scientific cultures in the UK and the United States, there's not only a more permissive attitude toward creativity and toward wild dissent and disagreement, it's actually valued and revered. And I think in the US, for a number of reasons, there's much less tolerance for that. So just 2 quick points here. The idea that it was considered radical and even crazy, questioning the pathophysiology of AIDS, this is actually bizarre. Just to comment in a way that might not, I hope, be too scientifically nerdy, everyone knows COVID is a virus, right? Lots of people got infected with COVID. But did they all die? No. Did all of them get incredibly ill? No. There's a variety of different responses to infection with the virus, and Joe felt that the pathophysiology through which HIV ends up being a cause of AIDS was insufficiently characterized. So just to be clear, that was Joe's view at the end of everything. And I want to just make the point that Sir Richard Dahl, a mentor of ours in Oxford University, who was involved in studies showing the link between tobacco and lung cancer, he said that tobacco was a cause of lung cancer. So again, Joe's not out on a limb there. So Joe and I had a passionate connection around the science of statistics and clinical trials design. And this is one area where those among the very best in the world felt Joseph was a peer and really valuable. Paul Meyer, who Joe made me go to a talk he did and thereby introduced us, but Joe didn't get to know Paul till later. He's one of the most important statisticians in the US. He invented something called the Kaplan-Meier survival curve, if there's any nerds out there. But this is the method in statistics that's generally used to assess whether drugs work or not in clinical trials. So we were at a meeting at MFAR, and Paul was a bit late, and Joe was speaking. They hadn't met yet. And he listened to Joe for a minute, and he turned to me and goes, "Who is that guy? I like him." And Paul didn't often speak that way. So of course they were very close friends. Joe loved the beauty of learning details after he'd done some trials from Paul and from Richard Pito and others about how to design trials. But at its best, epidemiology is really a refined form of activism. And the goal of clinical trials is not to be some sort of abstract gold standard, but it's really a technology for resolving medical controversy. And randomized evidence has produced population-level changes in mortality. And that's where Joe ultimately wanted AIDS research to go, community-based research. But epidemiology, epidemiologists are rarely loved. Joe left AMFAR as a result of a conflict around epidemiology when our friend, the late Terry Byrne, who was living with AIDS, decided that AIDS wasn't being taken seriously enough, and therefore it was important to create the perception that there was a risk to heterosexual men from heterosexual sex in the US. And there wasn't really evidence for that view, although later in Africa and in other places there is. But Joe always talked to me about this when he had it out with Terry about this. Terry said, look, I've got a virus in me and it's pointed straight at my brain. And that was Terry's experience. And Joe struggled mightily but had to leave. Joe was an incredibly flexible mentor and scientist. And yes, he did say AZT is poison. And yes, AZT in 1959 was abandoned as a chemotherapy because it was too non-specifically toxic. But when I had worked with Sir Richard Peto and Donald Abrams at University of California to design a study looking at immediate versus deferred antiretroviral therapy, Joe was a profound supporter, and he was delighted by the fact that I was able to move ahead. And he offered his office to be one of the first. So I just want to make that point about his flexibility. And then sort of the last thing I want to say is, many people got angry with Joseph because, CRI didn't get things done and he didn't get things done. But I think I have to defend the role of physician scientists in a sense. If there's not infrastructure to help you, then it's very difficult to get things done, and I just want to make that point. Most of all, though, right now, I want to thank our musicians, Joe's colleagues. When he decamped to London for a better life, his musical life brought him great joy. And so thank you, Morgan, Andrew, Charles, Emily, Elder, Michael. We're so glad to have you here, and Joe would be delighted to be hearing you. Thanks.
It was quite early in 2020, the first year of the pandemic, that Andrew Tooby messaged me and said, could you help my rather elderly and slightly cranky student with his solo violin piece? And this was the start of my collaboration with Joe, which was sadly only ever online. He basically never left his apartment after COVID hit, and I never got to actually meet him. But I'm really proud of the work we did together quite intensively on this piece over the summer, particularly of 2020, and I was able to record it in my home and send it to him, so he did at least get to hear this piece. think I'm correct in saying this is one of the pieces by Joe which is being played this afternoon. This is the one which would have been written while he was based in New York. And it's called April. It was originally called Nostalgic. And a pianist who played it recently, he likened it somewhat to as if Arnold Schoenberg meets Broadway.
I was introduced to Joe in 1998 by my friend Susan Brown, who's here with us today. Susan assisted him as manager of data, among other things, for the drug treatment trials Joe directed. Susan recommended that I be hired to take board minutes during a contentious transition from his position as the founding medical director of CRI, Community Research Initiative, which is now CRIA. Shortly after doing that job, I became Joe's patient. He exchanged his fee for my helping him with clerical work at his private practice in a small apartment in Chelsea. By then, I had already been diagnosed with HIV, but I was still asymptomatic. As time went by, my T cells plummeted. Joe followed a protocol of deferring pharmaceutical treatment until absolutely necessary, his reasons being to allay interaction, the side effects from the drugs, and of course, resistance. When my T-cell count approached the double digits, Joe started prescribing prophylactics against PCP and various viral infections. One day, shortly afterwards, I experienced a headache of such proportions I'd never experienced in my life. Susan and some friends, I believe her partner Brad, who's also with us here today, took me to Joe's office, by which point I was barely conscious. I do remember Joe taking one look at me and telling them to get me to Roosevelt Hospital now. Of course, Roosevelt has now become Mount Sinai West. He said, get me there immediately and without delay. He told them to bring overnight items that I might need because he anticipated that I would be dealing with some days of inpatient care. Joseph had hospital privileges at Roosevelt by that point, and he arrived at the hospital shortly after I was admitted. He had in his office instantly spotted what the hospital would diagnose, that I had contracted cryptococcal meningitis, a rapidly moving and deadly infection if left untreated. As was earlier said, Joe was a brilliant diagnostician. He literally saved my life. The crypto was the AIDS-defining diagnosis that led Joe to put me on antiretrovirals. By this time, he had come to acknowledge that AZT had an antiretroviral effect, albeit minimal and short-lasting, but AZT's toxicity could be minimized if prescribed in proper doses. And as we heard, Joe was an early critic of AZT, but after realizing that it was being overdosed, he saw that it really did help with keeping the virus down. So having kept me off of AZT until the very last minute, bought time for Joe to include me in the early protease inhibitor trials. This strategy, followed by his prescient employment of the HIV cocktail, is a direct factor in my long-time survival, as well as on the lives of countless others. My background as a choreographer was a bridge in our friendship. Joe's lifelong devotion as a contemporary classical composer and musician was a Creative Commons. And of course, it was as much a surprise to me because it took years for that to really come to the surface. I think as he reached retirement, he said, oh, well, I'm going to now start doing what I've always done, which is compose music. And surprise, surprise, a lot of his compositions are atonal and 12-tone, which somehow for me kind of vibes in with Joe's general personality and attitude. It's not easy listening. But if you listen to it, and especially with the performances that we're seeing today, is watching the interpretation and listening to the music itself, it's extremely emotional and extremely expressive, I find. Our shared interest in socialized living, along with Joe's critical view of academia, bureaucracy, and institutionalism in general, made for many interesting conversations over the years. I was greatly honored to have visited Joe twice in his London homes after his retirement from medical practice.
In 1998, when we ran that cover story profile of Joe Sonnabend that you've seen up here where it says on the cover, "The Good Doctor," inside the headline on the article itself, on the cover it says, "The Man Who Knows Too Much," that picture. Inside the headline on the article itself was "The Good Doctor," and it was an interview I conducted with Joe. If I were to rewrite that headline today, I would probably have it say, the better doctor or the best doctor. And this is something I want to just say clearly for anybody who doesn't understand this. Joe's patients lived longer. They did better. And this is not, people with AIDS would talk about different doctors when we were calculating survival estimates and so on, and opportunistic infections and all the different things. Who they were seeing was also relevant, which is why Joe often got patients who ended up looking for a salvage therapy with another doctor. Then they came to Joe. Joe felt that every salvage therapy patient was a failure in the doctrine. He also never shrugged his shoulders and said, well, you've got AIDS, you're going to have to expect some of these things, as so many people were told with persistent diarrhea or other kinds of problems. There was always another test, another strategy, another route of hope with Joe. If there was ever an analysis of patient outcomes and survival rates based on the clinicians who tested them or who treated them, Joe would be at the very top of that list, be amongst the very, very most successful in that regard. The second point I wanted to make is to remind people how profoundly maligned Joe was, how he was marginalized. And not just the pain that caused Joe, which it did, but what it cost us as a community and a society because he wasn't listened to, because his ideas weren't taken as seriously, because there was such an effort to silence his voice. Gay Men's Health Crisis' hotline at one point told patients who called and were asking for a doctor to go to anybody but Joe Sonnabend. Sonnabend is crazy, they would tell them. Years later, Roger McFarland, who had been executive director of GMHC, sent a beautiful note of apology to Joe that he treasured, where he apologized for his own role in GMHC's being complicit in helping to marginalize him in that way. Joe was repeatedly denied funding. He lost relationships. He was maligned in the media. Early on in this church downstairs, I think Bill Hipsher referenced it, when the Buyers Club, one of their first projects was manufacturing AL-721, which was an egg lipid. And they found a lab in New Jersey that would make it for them. But they wanted to get it tested to make sure it was exactly right. And Joe found a lipid chemist at Brown University, spent a day with him, asked him if he would help with it, and he agreed. Till a few days later, called back, said he couldn't do it. He had checked with someone at the National Institutes of Health and was told not to have anything to do with Joe Sonnabend. Even in our own community and community journalists, Joe was sometimes called an AIDS denialist, which was simply not true. You can never find, this is simply not true. It was implied that he was a mass murderer. That was the phrase in one of the articles, and other things. So in addition to being one of the most consequential people from those early years of the epidemic in all sorts of arenas, research and prevention to policy, advocacy, privacy, ethics, he also is, I think, not just one of the least heralded, under-recognized and appreciated, but also perhaps most unfairly maligned. In his last years, he donated much of his archive to libraries and institutions in the US and the UK. But he kept 2 plastic storage bins in his apartment, very close to him, right to the end. They were filled with hundreds of cards and letters from patients, surviving partners, parents, family members, writing from Minneapolis or Cedar Rapids or Peoria, thanking Joe for the care and love they showed to their loved ones. I spent hours with Joe reading them and hearing Joe tell me about every single patient. It was astonishing that his memory was so perfectly precise with those patients. He'd tell you about their apartments. He'd tell you about the art that they made. He'd tell about a comment their mother made when she was visiting. It was really remarkable. Joe never gave up on any of his patients. He never gave up on us. which is, I think, one of the reasons why so many of us who loved him and understand and appreciate what he accomplished and what the price has been for maligning and dismissing him in the way he has been, are so committed to making sure that his legacy is not overlooked, the history is not rewritten. I very much appreciate the comments from Kevin Frost shared about AMFAR and clarifying that for the record, which is very important. It's not overlooked by history, rewritten, or otherwise distorted by those threatened by the powerful truths he told throughout his life and career.
Others who said it, Sean has said it, it's unparalleled. In the early days when I knew Joe, I would accompany friends to go see him in that office. Can we talk about it? Like, there were papers lined in the hallway, there were folding chairs or chairs along the side of the wall, there'd be lots of patients waiting. You'd go into the room and maybe you'd be there for 30 minutes, maybe you'd be there for an hour. But Joe would take extraordinary care of you and explain everything to you and explain what the test results meant. Help you think about what your options were in that very moment. And these were the days when I was going in with friend to friend. Jay Funk, who was ex-lover of my ex-lover, Mark Cameron, who was very, very sick with HIV. And Joe took care of his patients to the bitter end. A few days before Jay died, he was in his apartment on East 7th Street, and I remember Joe coming over. And Jay, by this time, had disseminated KS. He'd been very, very sick. And Joe gave him one last injection. And I was like, doing this. And then I realized it wasn't for Jay, it was for his friends all around him, that he was taking care of us and saying, look, I'm not going to let go until it's time to let go. Fast forward a few more years, my cousin Carl, who I grew up with, was the only, well, there were two other gay people in our family, including me, but he was getting sick. And who did I trust and refer to as a doctor? Joe, and Donald Hopper as well. And I would take Carl to see Joe in that office, and Joe would work with him. And Carl was not a treatment data nerd from ACT UP. He was trying to understand what was going on in his life. He developed disseminated aspergillosis. He also had KS, and Joe took care of him. And one of the interesting things is, you know, Sean was saying Joe never gave up on patients, but he also didn't ever lie. I remember towards the end, Don Copper and Joe had to tell my cousin that there's nothing more I can do. And I remember standing outside the door frame and hearing that phrase and realizing how difficult it must have been to say that. Let's fast forward a little bit more. I get a phone call from Joe. I'm living on 12th Street and 2nd Avenue, and Joe is coming over. This is not a house call I want, right? At that point, I was HIV negative. By the end of the afternoon, I was HIV positive. And Joe came and sat me down. And you can picture Joe, like he's looking down, he has the sheepish sort of look on his face telling me that I'm HIV positive. It's 1995. It's right before the advent of antiretroviral therapy. And I have to make choices. And the skepticism that Joe brought to his clinical practice and brought to treating my cousin, Jay Funk, and others, now was bestowed upon me to help me think about what my choices were in that very moment. Was it to go into kind of a trial of protease inhibitors, which I ended up doing, or to defer and wait until we had better data. But Joe taught me how to think about medicine, about epidemiology, about my own health, about the health of our communities. One last story I want to tell is about Joe and his scientific influence. We can talk about his work in the 60s and 70s and 80s at the bench, but he had a profound influence on what happened later in AIDS research. I remember in 93 or 94, Joe was like, I have patients that are not getting sick. I know they were infected in the 70s or early 80s and they're not getting sick. And so was it email? then patiently listened to us and said, okay, I'm going to do a run of the multi-center AIDS cohort, which was the largest cohort of people living with HIV at the time. And I was working up at Columbia in a fly lab, changing fly media and doing all this sort of tech stuff during the day and at night during my ACT-UP meetings. And when I stayed late at the lab, and the fax machine always started doing this weird spool. Remember when the fax machine had the little things you had to pull off the sides? In any case, I'm like, what is this? And it's the data from the Max. And guess what? There were long-term survivors in the multi-center AIDS code, right? A few months later, there's a meeting at the National Institute of Health on long-term non-progressors. And where did this come from? It came from Joe's exquisite clinical instincts. That not everybody dies of HIV. Not everybody dies in COVID. And that there's something special about those people in his practice and across the United States who are not getting sick with HIV. That discovery led to the discovery. That discovery and insight of Joe's led to the discovery of the CCR5 receptor, the second receptor HIV needs to get into cells, which ended up developing a whole new class of therapies for HIV. And so while Joe's early work in interference is important, his scientific instincts and his clinical insights led to advances that even he probably wasn't aware of towards the end of his life. And so we're honoring him here today. My greatest gift that Joe gave to all of us with living with HIV is what he did for us as patients. What he did for activists, he gave us a history of skepticism and critical thinking that was desperately important. And to the world, he gave us an ability to think bigger about science and grounded in clinical insight and what's happening in people's bodies. Thanks so much.
Could everyone hear? Right. No? Okay. Could you hear us back? No, I'm going to go up there then. Hi, my name's Ash Kotak. I got to know Joe through Sean Strew in 2017. I was leading the campaign to establish an AIDS memorial in London. Believe it or not, we don't have one. They do in Belarus and Russia, in Moscow. I've seen it. And it was a tragedy that we didn't have something there. So I met Joe, and we kind of hit it off straight away. And he started telling me his stories. And I thought, what a great injustice that his narrative had been stolen away from him. It'd been rewritten, and people had taken advantage of him in all sorts of ways, financially, physically, and, as I said, his story. And so I said, because I had heard his music, why don't we launch your music, debut your music? And then that will give you an opportunity in the media to tell your own story. Because you own your own narrative. And only you can tell your narrative and set the story straight. I mean, it was terrible, terrible issues, like his whole archive at the LGBT Centre here in New York, which he placed for safekeeping, somehow got lost. It seemed that he was deliberately being attacked and misaligned. So I got in touch with a journalist friend at Vice. I said, can you tell this story? He said, yes. And the BBC did a documentary. The radio is 53 minutes long. Joseph Sonnabend, BBC. Please do listen to it. And it's in the archive now. So he has told his story in his own words. And then over a couple of days, I met Morgan and Andrew, coincidentally, at a play in London. And I said, you know, why don't we just do this? And he said, will anyone want to hear my music? I said, it's really important because it's music written at a specific time, at a very important time of AIDS. And we launched it sold out. We had 2 days. It was at the Fitzrovia Chapel, which is the remaining chapel of the Middlesex Hospital, which is the first AIDS ward in the UK. And there was a huge response. And Joe was very, very touched. Joe and I went back a long way without me even meeting Joe. I knew his sister Yolanda through Eve Pomerantz, who's here. And he was very close friends with my godson here in New York, Eve's son, grandparents, the writers Berman Pomerantz and Sally Belfridge. They used to share flats in London and in New York. And it was strange because I'd heard of this AIDS doctor. I never realised it was Joe. So him being Jewish, me being Hindu, we had a kind of connection immediately because it felt like family suddenly. That if you're Jewish or if you're Hindu, you'll kind of understand that. Or if you're Italian or Greek, you just connect because we had such a long history. And so we're all gathered here because he wanted to come to New York and do something in New York. Sean and I had spoken a lot about this, so I'm glad today's happened. It's sad that Joe's not here. He thought nobody would come, nobody would remember him, and nobody cared about him. But we do. He's very important. And this is the beginning of telling the truth about Joseph Sonnabend, as he is, as he was, as me, a long-time survivor of AIDS, living with HIV for 30 years. I appreciate somebody like Joseph Sonnabend and the whole history of HIV and AIDS. And it's really important that we move this forward. And Miriam, I know you're writing about him. Do a great job. He deserves it. Thank you very much.
I'm writing Joe's biography. So how did Joe become the person that you met? The one who cured what ailed you, who frustrated you or that you disagreed with, the one who inspired you, the man you loved. He gave us a chance to learn. Joseph Sonnabend kept good records and archived his materials. He also kept Italian leather-bound engagement books. Most were from the high-end Smythson of Bond Street for nearly every year from the early 1960s until 2019. And he used these books like one would a personal diary to doodle. He was a prolific doodler, writing down his musings, his hopes, and his angst. But starting in June 1981, he used the engagement books as an unintentional tracker of the first days and years of the AIDS crisis. Still, shortly before Larry Mass published the first news piece of mysteriously ill gay men in New York hospitals in May 1981 in the New York Native, or the CDC published its first report in the MMWR on June 5th, both of which heralded the official start of the AIDS epidemic, Joseph wrote on April 2nd in his diary, "My life is like repeatedly getting dressed and undressed, endlessly putting on and taking off clothes." And on Friday, April 3rd, he wrote, "I'm really at a loss. What to do? Where? How? No skills that are usable." Then Monday, June 8th, indicating he was well aware of the pneumocystis pneumonia case reports just 3 days earlier in the MMWR, he said, "It means that there is something immunosuppressive going on. A virus is doing?" I think it's fair to say he stopped wondering if he had any skills to offer after that. But even with such bountiful archival material, writing a biography about Dr. Sonnabend's life would not be an easy task, I was told. I heard often repeated that Joe was complicated, peculiar, difficult, moody, brilliant, obstinate, a radical skeptic, strange, and a weirdo. Weirdo has been the most frequently used word to describe him across all the interviews I have conducted so far. I needed to understand how the young Joseph came to be called by some, though, the first AIDS doctor. Why did his patients credit him with keeping them alive? Why did Don Kotler, the gastroenterologist who worked closely with Joseph, say to me that Joseph was like the now famous neurologist Oliver Sacks, both men, brilliant diagnosticians, and both perceived as oddballs to the rest of their peers? Unlike Oliver Sacks's childhood, which was not without its traumas, but nonetheless in stable environs in London, Joseph's childhood wasn't particularly stable. Joseph and his younger sister Yolanda were raised in Bulawayo, southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. Their parents were Jewish immigrants, both seeking places of higher learning, his father migrating from Poland to Germany, their mother traveling from small-town Russia to Leningrad. The parents met as students in Italy. Then once again, they needed to leave fascist Italy for South Africa in 1933, the year Joseph was born, once again on the move. Joseph's father lived primarily in Johannesburg, where he had a faculty appointment in sociology at Witwatersrand. And their mother and her sister were both physicians. Imagine that, quite a feat at the time. Joseph recalled later his mother's lumbering out the door in the middle of the night to deliver a baby or care for a sick patient. This being an on-call, at the bedside doctor remained central to Joseph in his own practice. Unfortunately, his mother, Fira, died when he was only 13. Their father didn't send for them to live in Johannesburg, nor did he return to Bulawayo to live. Their auntie, the mother's sister, raised them. Joseph's father, 10 years later, died suddenly at 54 years old in 1956, and Joseph found himself at 23 years old without both parents. While his father was larger than life and was in both he and his sister's lives, but mostly remotely, one gets the feeling that the siblings remained with a deep sense of loss and were like two unattached buoys bobbing in a vast ocean for the rest of their lives. In a childhood letter to his father, undated, Joseph wrote, "Dear Daddy, how are you? I am glad you are coming soon. There are school holidays now, but they end on the 23rd. Joseph was in boarding school. He goes on to say, "It is a pity you couldn't come before." Joseph would become close to father figures who were mentors of sorts to him in different stages of his life, such as Alec Isaacs, the co-discoverer of interferon, and those are produced by the body to fight off infections, who Joseph worked with at MRC Mill Hill in the UK, as Rebecca mentioned, under the directorship of Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. During that time, Joseph published with his good friend and colleague, Robert Friedman, a paper in 1965 in Nature, only the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. When Alec Isaacs became ill and was in the care of a psychiatric institution for some time, Joseph cared for him lovingly, sat at his bedside, corresponded, sought out his expertise, and never judged him. He aimed to find the best care for Alec until Alec's death from a brain hemorrhage at just age 45 in 1967. Another untimely death. There were other long-term mentors who helped ground both Joseph's aspirations and sensibility, such as Mervyn Susser, a physician from South Africa who also attended with and had opened a clinic in the township outside of Johannesburg. Joseph spent time working in this clinic before taking that job on the pilgrim ship on the way to Mecca. Joseph had become fully engaged in what providing care to people living in extreme poverty was like. He saw firsthand the devastation of the white ruling colonial government of South Africa and its racist policies, and how racism and poverty prey on and multiply comorbidities and socioeconomic deprivation among those who it oppressed. Susser, as with René Dubos, the microbiologist, who was also foundational to Joseph's worldview, Joseph knew that viruses are affected by and interact with the environment we live in and our other underlying health conditions. It is for this reason that Joseph appeared as the devil's advocate, I think, often calling out, why are we only focusing on antiretroviral treatment? Like any gold standard microbiologist, he kept reminding the public health and medicinal communities how little was known about the natural history, the trajectory of HIV. Don't you think that opportunistic infections or underlying cytomegalovirus or Epstein-Barr could be important in speeding up the progression of HIV disease? And how can you only treat HIV in a siloed manner in Southern Africa and not the determinants of health that make people ill? Why do we not care enough about ensuring access to clean drinking water, sanitation, improved nutrition too? The injustice incensed him. I will leave you with one funny window into Joseph at age 11. In a tattered, leather-bound autograph book from 1943, amid names of his family and signatures of his friends, and a heart with an arrow through it that he drew, 11 years old Joseph wrote in the cover, Sir Joseph A. Sonnabend, Jr., 35 Wealthy Street, East Brooklyn, New York, USA. I think we can say that he did become rich through all the lives he helped, as I look out on all of you who loved him and who are here today to celebrate his life. Thank you.
If any of you are anxiously looking at your watches, I can promise that the second half of this afternoon's event should be well under 1 hour. Joseph's piano trio is certainly towards the difficult end of the spectrum of his music, but as I was so pleased to hear Jack Waters pointing out, the music has this incredible quality of expression, of emotion, of reflecting the person, the whole of the person who Joe was. So, yeah, this is his piano trio, which is about 10 minutes long.
So I'm glad everybody got to meet Miriam. So in the program we have a QR code and a website where you can message the David and Simon from the state for any stories you may want Miriam to know about. Among those many stories, obviously, in this moment, what we're living in this country, we just have to remind ourselves, like, what would Joe, be telling us? Basically, is to be doing what we've been doing all this time, just like what he did. He already built us structures that many of us already have done all these years. Miriam has been interviewing Greg, for example, who spoke a lot. And I hope in that story, Miriam, he's also told you that through his survival, he and several activists like Mark Harrington and him helped force this country to have a vaccine center. To even think that we didn't have that. But that's the power of him taking care of these patients that became activists and have not stopped. So unfortunately, we're in a time where we have to retool again, find a new path. The stories of the health group where we actually had people's family help us bring thalidomide from Brazil and recategorize to help with KS, where people actually helped us bring medication that was illegal in this country and recategorize for KS so that we can live longer. We never have really spoken about those stories. And the part of Joe being erased is very important for us to constantly take space in our life and address that. And Miriam, of course, I just wanted to also share that because every opportunity to have activists, here is what I call, campfire AIDS activist chats to dispel what is not true. And one of the core things that when he passed away, prior to that, he had told me that of the many archives that he had left, some in the New York Public Library in London, he left one of the, I believe, you know, a very important part of history to the LGBT Center, and it was his work that, as he tracked into the, you know, around the 80s, as this was happening, and we didn't even have the words HIV, all the way to him becoming a doctor here. He decided that documentation belonged to the LGBTQ community, and he donated those archives. In those archives, at one point, most of it had been shredded. And we're coming to reclaim that story for him. And this is where, you know, he also teaches us how hard it is to stay in ground, and how hard this work is as activism, and how hard it is to remain working despite how much people tear you down. And that's where we are in this country, and we have to lift. So I have said many times, we are the survivors of Joe Sonnabend. We are the family, but every single person that's an activist that have known him is his survivor. I hope you had enjoyed some of the different images that everybody sent in, especially of Quilly, that cat who belonged to Yolanda, who's extremely loved by Simon. Today's also my youngest son's birthday. He turns 21. And that is Joe's work. And please, everybody, despite of you have read and own one of these booklets from How to Have Safe Sex, please take one, two, give it to young people. So many people call us at ACT UP, oh, we want to write about you and refer to this book, but they never fucking looked at inside. And that's fucking important, because it's our first harm reduction for HIV and AIDS, and that is cemented, and that it's a pathway for so many other work. And then, you know, what would Joe want us to be? To stay kind, to truly, profoundly love each other, and that every work that we have done since we met him, while he was alive, after he's alive, this moment, has his DNA in activism. We're gonna have a little break, commingle, because, you know, a lot of us haven't seen each other in years. And when we come back, the collaborators of Joe continue to have some music for us. And I know some people need to go to Passover, so I really appreciate you showing up for us. Thank you.
This is the exact place where the PWA Health Group was launched. And in 1987, and we all thought we were going to be arrested. I'm Andy Hunt, Mike Powell, and Tom Bennett and Joe wrote me into getting on their board, and it was a very fraught situation. And Arlene Carmen from this church, who's the administrator, was put on our board. And in 1967, this is what I'm going to finish by saying, she was the head of the abortion referral group that clergy were doing in New York before abortion was legal in New York. So this church took tremendous risks on our behalf, and that's what we all need to do now.
A message for Donna, who's been photographing Joe since like the early days, wants photos of all us together. So where do you want us to be? Are they just the speakers? Okay. But Andy now is part of the speakers.
Yeah, he had to leave, but he said hi.
You were fancying your home and goal. So you two know each other? Morgan, Sally. You know Mark? Yes. Very cool. Yes. Yeah. So Morgan started just after we left. And he's from Hastings. Maybe you must have started a year after me. Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But just at some point, we need to go and prepare. Yeah. It's also
kind of talking him into completing his work, all the pieces that we heard earlier. Now, I know for some of you this is like an additional program, but people at Chapman, we enjoyed your talk and we'd like you to listen. But they're not listening now, so it's a difficult one. Anyway, up to them. Now, if you're interested in Joe's work, we made a CD of some of the work that you heard earlier. It's available to buy. I'm tempted to give it at a lockdown price because we've been here and put so much time and effort into our listening and concentration on things today. But we'll see what they do. I don't even know who's here. I'm going to say $10. Anyone want one for $10? Jeff, sorted over there. Yeah? Now, you're going to hear a couple of pieces of mine. Actually, it's interesting. Joe was particularly interested in Schoenberg's album there. When I was a kid, I listened to a lot of folk music and Bartok. So the two exits in here are basically based on my love of Bela Bartok and folk music. When Joe wrote a lot of his music, it was based very much on Earl Schoenberg's album there. And in actual fact, one of the first things I did when I met him was hear him play the Bear piano sonata, which, from memory, which was amazing, because it's blooming difficult. I could have said a worse word, but I think we're in church, I'll be a little bit more polite. So, the next piece you'll hear is a piece I've written especially for tonight's, it's more or less tonight, I'll say tonight, event, which is called The Other Person. And it's a recitation of a poem, and actually it doesn't mention on the programme, there's a lot of things not mentioned on the programme, actually. Charles Mutter, who's been not only playing the piano, but playing the violin. I'm surprised he's not juggling and kind of floating in the ceiling. He's also going to recite the poem by the critic Paul Driver, who wrote for many, many years with Sunday Times. So I feel very privileged to be able to be connected with his work. And it's about the other person, it's about how we have relationships with people, and yet sometimes they can be kind of weird and strange, and like you're chatting away to someone and then the other person's here and you're not really communicating. So you may not always hear the poem. Now earlier, I noticed they're still around. I put the poem out on an A4 sheet. So if you want to read it and thinking what the hell's going on, there it is. But it's also just about how we communicate with each other. So let's see what happens. And my earlier comment about how we communicate still hasn't quite got through to some people. What do I do?
We'll just play it.
Alright, we'll just play it and we'll listen and enjoy. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this. And as I say, $10. That's good, isn't it? Whole CD, 10, you know the thing, you'll be a CD player. It's good, believe me. Enjoy.
pass on the stairs of the underground maze, myself and an arbitrary other. I glance at the face and pick up the grace at once of a serious character. And daunting to feel how solidly real the evanescent can be. The instantly known, yet never to be known. The alternative to me. With as much of a hold on the passing world as I might claim instead. But I'm still unsure there isn't a law that locks me in my own head. It's a prompting today to disobey the solipsistic stricture, to reach out beyond me, considering fondly who lives at the back of the picture, the figures unfamed in the moral frame, the suffering of the human, the differing scope of the everyday hope, the diverse exaltation. The minor triumph, the major gazump. This one who's lost a house bid. That lady who passed the hard driving test this morning. That man who got rid of a punishing debt. And this one who's just met a wonderful person. And wonders what unsurmised future might just be in store. And the young man, worried by blunders he fears, will have marred the impression he made at the rather posh party in Windsor. Of course we go on as we've always done, pursuing our own sweet way, with our petty concerns and our urgent concerns besieging us as they may. Yet, mightn't one trial, just once in a while, to walk in another's shoes, to venture the leap, the impossible leap into ill-fitting joys and woes, and feel in your heart and even your gut the great equivalent thing when you look at new toes and beyond your nose at a red raw suffering. You'll stand in the space of their mortal place, be riven by their anxiety. Your daughter is ill, your job is still in the balance in the city. Your housemates are clamouring for better contributing, your flat's flat roof's awry. You feel that your life's on the edge of a knife, you'll die if they will die. But no, in this world it isn't allowed. The person's lost to the floor, above or below, where you cannot follow. Our empathy shuts like a door, for all you prefer to keep it ajar. The eye of a secular heaven assuring us none of us will be foregone, and all the odds made even. that the longing for better belonging is just not practical. Rescinded the stare on the moving stair. But was it noticed at all? 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 If you remember, one of the slides had Joseph with Andrew, I think, on his left, and another person behind holding a music score, looking slightly surprised, and sort of gold behind them. That person holding the score open is Michael Finnessy, who was a really terrific, eminent British composer and another admirer of Joe's work. And I'm going to finish by playing his piece, Lone Pilgrim, which is dedicated to Joe, and I think the title pretty much says it all. Chaps, I don't need a page turner, but I might need a page rescuer. So could one of you be on hand?